morning. Some years ago, Susan and I were invited to a particular function by a couple in our congregation. It was a particular celebration, an anniversary, a special anniversary of the couple. And so we turned up at the venue and there were tables decorated and laid out. And we're seated at a particular table. There was a couple we knew and several we didn't know, who were obviously relatives and friends of this couple, close friends from another context. Anyway, as the night progressed, the conversation flowed, sometimes in small groups, twos and threes, and sometimes as a whole table. And on one of those occasions where we're all in the conversation together, someone asked one of the couples about their son and how he was going. And the conversation flowed around that. And as it progressed, it became clear that this son, this young adult son, was well known. Someone we should have known, and was featured in the media in recent times. And as the questions and the conversation continued, the parents of this young man were able to share, I guess, their insights and their story, and probably put some context into the media coverage that wasn't always positive. And it created some distress in this young man's life, I think particularly mental health issues. But as the conversation flowed, I still didn't know who this person was. I was supposed to know, I'm sure it was well known, but it wasn't clear. But as people said more and more things, different bits of the puzzle came together, and I got glimpses and glimpses of this person trying to put a face and a name to this entity, this one they were talking about. Sometimes that's what I feel like when I come to these stories of Easter that we read. And over these last couple of weeks, trying to wrestle with the different stories of Easter that come from those we call Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The different stories around Easter and how they come together and what they're trying to say. Building up a picture that's mysterious, and sometimes I gain a glimpse of some insight and some reality, and then it slips away. I think I've got it, but then it shifts. And I'm not quite sure what it's really talking about. The stories of Easter are bewildering. In some ways they don't make sense in our lives, in our world, but in other ways they do. This week, as we come to Luke's story, there's a whole chapter in his first volume dealing with this Easter. It begins with women at the tomb who go to prepare the body for burial and find the tomb empty, and these angelic figures who proclaim he's risen. And they're confused and they don't know what it means. And they go back and tell the disciples, and Peter runs and finds an empty tomb and doesn't know what to make of it. The disciples are confused and afraid and uncertain. And then the second story he tells is of two disciples previously unnamed who are leaving Jerusalem and going home to their village of Emmaus. And as they walk and they're sharing their sadness and the frustration, the bewilderment, a figure joins them and asks what they're talking about. And they tell him, and he enlightens them with stories of faith and how God's story is not one of death and dying and struggle, but one of life that comes out of the pain and the reality of life. How God works within the humility of people and the small places and the small people to bring hope and life to our world. And kind of reinterprets the story and fits Jesus' own story into that. And it captures their imagination. And as they come to their home, he moves on, but they call him back and invite him in for dinner. And as they sit at the table, he takes bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. And their eyes are opened. And they see the risen Christ in their midst. And he disappears. And this is the kind of story that we hear of Jesus appearing and disappearing, of physicality and spirit. And Luke goes to great extremes in his third story, where the disciples are still bewildered, and these two disciples, Cleopas and the other one, come running back from Emmaus to tell them what they've experienced. And as they're talking and the disciples are trying to make sense of what's happening, this Jesus appears in the midst, this risen Christ, and says, "Peace be with you," and shows them his hands and his feet to help them recognise him, his woundedness. When we were gathered around that table at that function, I was trying to find a face. I was trying to form a picture of a face that fitted the data I was receiving, the information, to try and put a face and then a name to this person they were talking about. Jesus doesn't use his face, but uses his wounds. He's recognised in his woundedness, in his brokenness. And then the disciples are confused and bewildered and still afraid, but cautiously joyful. And he says, "Give me some broiled fish. I'm not some disembodied spirit. I have flesh and bones." Luke goes to great extremes to present this risen Christ not as a disembodied spirit, but at the same time, in physicality, is not a resuscitated body. It's not the same Jesus who walked and talked with them before Friday. It's a new thing. This one materializes and disappears, enters rooms that are locked, comes here and there, but has flesh or has physicality or something. It's mystery. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know how to make sense of that. And I don't think the disciples did either, by the way that they're reported in these stories. It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense. And I wonder to myself, what is it Luke is trying to say, and what do I make of all of these stories of Matthew, Mark and Luke and John and Paul and others? And what does it mean to me in my life? Luke himself was writing towards the end of the first century, in the 80s, maybe 60 years after Jesus, to a community of disciples, of Christian disciples who were in a different world that was becoming more and more complex and difficult for them as this Christian movement waned somewhat after those initial years of energy and excitement and wonder. And as the persecutions and the struggles under empire and the separations from the Jewish faith and the new emergent Jewish faith in the synagogue movement after the destruction of the temple had pushed them apart. And these Christian communities were almost scapegoats in the world, particularly for the powers of empire. Luke seems to have been saying to this Christian community of his, remain firm and remain strong. He goes to great lengths in his story of Jesus to show the continuity with what God has always been and God has always done. And that this story is not new in one sense, but continues the old story of God taking the raw and the rough and the struggling places and bringing life. Of using people who are lowly and weak and struggling, insignificant often, and using them to bring hope and life and the prophetic word. The alternative voice in a community of power and might. The alternative to the empire. In the beginning of his story, he has little people. Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary and Joseph, Anna, Simeon. And they're held over and against the big and the powerful of the world. Caesar Augustus, King Herod, the leaders of their own nation, the political, religious leaders. But the little ones are the ones through whom God can work. And it's not in the places of power or might, Rome or Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem, a little village, small and insignificant. And in his first sermon, in his hometown, Jesus says, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor. Recovery of sight to the blind, and release of the captives, and the lame to walk, and the liberation of the oppressed, to announce the great and glorious day of the Lord. His life and his work and his ministry and his teaching was to go amongst the marginalised and impoverished and struggling communities, to people who are suffering, who are broken, and lift them up. And to announce to the powerful and the wealthy and the strong that they need to let go and join these weak and powerless people in community. And he gathered people around the table to eat and drink and share common food. No matter where they were in the levels of society, in the strata, we're all equal. And we need to share life together. And in these resurrection stories, he is known by bringing peace. He's known in his woundedness and the brokenness. He's known in the frailty of humanity and of his humanity. But he's also known in the community, breaking bread, of hospitality, of receiving broiled fish in this story. And then in commissioning the disciples to go out into the world and be witnesses. Witnesses to his life and his way, this way of God in the world, this way of love and life and liberation. To go and proclaim forgiveness. To go and proclaim reconciliation, to be people of healing and peace and reconciliation in the world. And that's their mission, because that's what his mission was, and that's the mission of God in our world. And for me, these resurrection stories give a language and a voice to the experiences of resurrection, the risen Christ, if you like, that I have, that you have, that we glimpse, like in that conversation around the table that Susan and I were engaged in, of a face gradually becoming more and more real, and a figure and the life, and hearing the tradition, the wholeness of his life and the life of his family. And finally, someone saying something that brought all the pieces together, and me going, aha, that's who it is. I recognise him now, but this is a deeper, broader, truer person than I'd understood, than I'd seen in the media. I see a life, and I see the struggle, and I know him more truly in his struggle and brokenness, and that of his family. And for me, the risen Christ is present in the brokenness of humanity, in the brokenness of the world, in the brokenness of the climate changing and the globe warming and creatures suffering and rainforests and other areas of bushland and forests being destroyed, of the decimation of creatures, of people in conflict and warfare and fighting, of the suffering and the persecution of human beings, of the impoverishment of people. God is present in the brokenness. And it's out of that brokenness that God brings life and hope. And uses people who are broken people, who are ordinary people, who are simple people, to proclaim life and to stand up against the powers and principalities of the world in the way of Jesus, and to announce a different way, a way of love, of community, of equality, of inclusion. This is the way of God, and this is what the stories of Easter proclaim and invite me into and challenge me with. Will you join in this way of Jesus, this way of God, this way of Easter?